Formula One circuits are always changing, but none so much as the Nürburgring. Once upon a time, Grand Prix cars ran through the trees at frighteningly high speeds along a 23-kilometre long road known as the Nordschleife, which still exists, but since the 1980s, F1 has elected to run a more modern, high-tech layout of the circuit specifically designed for Grands Prix. That is, when they run there at all, of course. For the 2002 European Grand Prix, so named because the German Grand Prix was run at Hockenheim, the track changed again, with a brand new arena section accommodating 8,000 more spectators and adding 15 seconds to the overall lap time. After winning 6 of the first 8 races and finishing on the podium every time, it was becoming clear that Michael Schumacher would absolutely glide to the World Championship. But to the shock of his home crowd, it was actually the 2 Williams cars of Juan Pablo Montoya and Ralf Schumacher who locked out the front row of the grid, separated by just 9 thousandths of a second. This was important, as Ralf, Juan, David Coulthard and Rubens Barrichello were locked in a vicious fight for second in the championship, with the former 3 being separated by just 1 point and Rubens expected to catch up. The Ferraris lined up next, followed by the McLarens and the Renaults in a Noah's Ark formation. When the race began, Montoya got away well and rudely covered off Ralf, as behind them the Ferraris went 4 wide with Coulthard and Button into turn 1. Suddenly, it was side by side at Williams. Oh, what a thrilliums! Ralf came out ahead, what brilliance! As further back, the Jordans were being silliums. In yellow, as Barrichello said hello to a fellow named Juan, taking second, and a second later, he was P1. I can't keep up that rhyming thing for long, unfortunately, but what a first lap this has been for Rubens. 4th to 1st in 1 lap, my goodness. Totally makes up for winning the Anui trophy last video, right? Before the end of the first lap, Michael was all over Montoya for 3rd, although he'd have to wait until the tight chicane in order to get past, which he did on the inside. Apparently Michael actually helped to design that corner, although I couldn't find anything backing that up. Montoya came back at him into the final corner, although that set him up badly, and Coulthard had a look, which almost cost him a place in turn. Aye aye aye. After a dramatic first lap, let's take a look back at that hectic start, where if you look closely you can see the Williamses actually touched up front. Yes, that's going on the crunch count, rules are rules. By the way, we're in the worst heatwave of my lifetime here in the UK right now, so I can relate to this smoky Jordan. It is sweltering. In the early years of his career, Ralf Schumacher was criticised for letting his brother Michael through too easily all of the time, although now that they were fighting for wins, there was more of a reason to defend, no matter how much it hurt him. Here comes Michael's challenge though, to the inside, and he gets through for eternal aid or not on just the 2nd lap of the race. Suddenly Ferrari had their usual one too, and it had happened irritatingly quickly. So far we've had 2 teammate collisions, and we nearly had a 3rd as Trilly got super close to Jensen's butt and had to bail out with his front tyre now hexagonal. Careful Yano, you know what happens to flat-spotted tyres at that corner? As it happened, he just dropped from 8th to 12th. Whoopsie poopsie. Ow! Whoa, 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 whoa. Bump, bump, bump. I find it funny that in 2002, Ferrari and Schumacher were so dominant that in the top 3 we have 2 Ferraris and 2 Schumachers. On a more sensible note, here's Trilly passing McNish for P10. There he goes, no funny business, place gained. Giancarlo Fisichella's race was continuing to fall apart, figuratively and literally, as a piece of his bodywork flew off. Apparently the other Jordan of Takuma Sato had missing panels when he made his stop too, possibly as a result of the first corner collision. If there's one thing drivers never like to see, it's debris on the racing line, as punctures at that speed can be seriously dangerous. Talking of tyres, here comes Kimi, and that's quite a lock-up, and that's a corner that Kimi really doesn't like. On this occasion, he only dropped behind Button, but he wouldn't be so lucky 3 years later. Gamble, Kimi. And now, here's a fellow Finn doing the same thing. Kimi had patriotic fans even in the early days. Now, back Back at the front of the field, Ferrari had a big problem. Being Ferrari, they naturally wanted their lead driver in front of their number 2, and that would mean switching the two cars. However, this was only 3 races after the famous Austrian Grand Prix scandal, where they changed the outcome of the race at the final corner, and the backlash was still very much real from that. So much so that a meeting was taking place in Paris on this very day to decide if Ferrari's conduct was sanctionable. As a result, they were pretty much morally bound to hold position between the two cars. Everyone expected them to attempt to put Michael ahead of Rubens through strategy, but suddenly...
Fuel is not, and Michael spun! Michael's gone off the road!
Indeed he had! Ferrari still had a huge 1-2 lead in the race, but their job of getting Michael ahead of Rubens had suddenly got a whole lot harder. Here's a replay of how it happened, and to be honest, it doesn't really explain much. He just kinda goes. It's like a motorbike low side or something. Weird. Just to show you how dominant the Ferraris have been so far, here's Michael making his first pit stop, and he's still going to come out a few seconds ahead of Ralf to keep second. It makes you wonder how the Williamses took the front row of the grid, but I suppose fuel had something to do with it. Here's Barrichello in too, and his stop went just as smoothly. As for Juan Pablo Montoya, he was being rather anonymous considering he'd taken pole position the day before, and suddenly he had 2 Maccas on his backer. He held Coulthard off into the Dunlop hairpin, but the pressure didn't cease, and David went for it in turn 1. And they came together! Montoya spun the car around, breaking both of their suspensions and taking them both out of the race. David is furious! Look, I don't want to sound too harsh, as accidents happen when racing, but this was quite clearly Montoya's mistake in my opinion. He was distracted by David's overtake, and just didn't correct the car in time as it unsettled itself over the curb. It was the nearest of touches, but it was at just the right angle to absolutely destroy both of their races. Let me know in the comments if you have any different opinion here. Interestingly, this was Montoya's 3rd straight retirement from pole position. He actually got the same number of poles as Schumacher that year, but couldn't convert any of them into wins. Before long, the other Williams was fighting the other McLaren for 3rd place, but they were able to keep it clean until Ralf made his pit stop. You also may have noticed that Fisichella is also out of the race, and that was a legacy of his first corner incident. As for the Minardis, we've already seen one of them spin today, and Alex Young decided to make sure he wasn't outdone by spinning on his way into the pit lane. That's a lot of dirt he's kicked onto the track too. The other drivers will thank him for that. Not. Now, it's Raikkonen pits from 3rd. I just wanted to share with you this absolutely savage interview with David Coulthard.
With David Coulthard, in fact. David, Juan Pablo blamed that accident on his tyres, but whatever the reason, he must be spitting.
Oh, well, just well, it wasn't the tooth fairy really that gave him a problem,
But that's not all. Now listen to what happens when Juan Pablo comes over to confront him.
Congratulations.
Little conversation just going on between Juan Pablo and David Coulthard here while I'm speaking to him.
I spun. Hang on in there. I know that, you hit me. You think I don't know that?
Exactly. That's what you call a case of no shoot, Sherlock. So, let's talk strategy for a bit, shall we? It seemed to be taking place on a team-by-team basis. The Ferraris out in front appeared to be 2-stopping, although they had built out such a lead that by this point it really didn't matter and they could do whatever they liked. Kimi Raikkonen appeared to be 2-stopping as well, and seemed to be having a better time of it than Ralf Schumacher, who was trying to make a 1-stopper work. Also 2-stopping were the Renaults of Button, who at this point was ahead of Ralf, and Trulli, who was fighting to get past Ralf, but tensions were rising as the Saubers, then 7th and 8th, were 1-stopping and threatening to jump the Renaults. As points only went down to 6 back in 2002, it was basically Renault versus Sauber for the last point scoring positions. Haha, but... Up at the front, Michael pitted for his 2nd stop with 19 laps to go, and Rubens stayed out. The talk was still that Ferrari would attempt to swap the cars, and with Michael catching up before his stop, tension was rising. It looked as if there were only 4 realistic options. Either 1, Ferrari would swap the cars on track Austria style. 2, Ferrari would deliberately slow down Barrichello's pit stop. 3, Schumacher would catch and pass Barrichello on merit. Or 4, Barrichello would win the race. Which of those do you think happened, dear viewer? If you don't know the answer, now would be the time to make your predictions. So, here's Rubens a lap later, in the pits. What's his stop time? Schumacher getting slightly held up by the Saubers, and Barrichello's out in 7.6. Looks like option 2 is ticked off.
Martin, I can tell you every single mechanic in every single pit garage in this pit lane's hearts are beating.
Well, yeah, I should hope so. I tell you what though, Michael had been really pushing. These were the scenes with 12 laps to go, with Michael catching up to the back of Barrichello, and the tension insane. Add into the mix that this was taking place in Michael's home country, and you get a cocktail of bizarre emotions brewing up in the final third of the race. Not involving Young, Irvine or Salo though. Obviously the intensity was just too much for these 3 cars, which all packed up in the later stages. We've just seen Salo spin as his gearbox packed up, and now around goes Frentzen, although with less catastrophic results. The Arrows team were in dire need of a good result at this point in the season, as their financial woes were getting worse and worse. Just 2 Grand Prix after this, the team would be forced to deliberately fail to qualify for a race in order to keep costs down, although soon after they dropped out of the sport entirely. Finally, with the cameras burning holes into the back of Ross Brawn and Jean Todd's heads, the Ferrari reached the final corner, and the question was, would they? Would they? No, they jolly well wouldn't. Rubens Barrichello finally picked up a long overdue second F1 victory, and a well-deserved one at that. He had beaten Michael Schumacher on his home soil and reversed the wrongs of Austria. This was a true feel-good result for Formula 1, but especially for Rubens. Kimi Räikkönen came home third for only his 2nd podium, and the other point scorers were Ralf Schumacher, Jenson Button, and Felipe Massa was 6th after the Saubers jumped Trilly. I'd also like to give a quick shout out to the Arrows cars of Bonaldi and Frentzen, because it would be the last time either Arrows would finish a Grand Prix, and Bonaldi brought it home an impressive 10th place. Shame points only went down to 6th really. Guys, before I give this race a score, I want to let you know that I have a Daily Motion account for all the races that get taken down from my YouTube channel by the pesky FOM bots. Due to the high levels of parody, review and education my videos contain, as well as the short lengths of the clips I use, I believe that all of my videos fall under fair use, but sadly this isn't always enough. On my Daily Motion account, you can find the 1996 Monaco and Portuguese Grand Prix, as well as any other video that may end up being taken down from my YouTube channel. The link is in the description. Thank you. I gave the Grand Prix a 3.3 out of 10, as sadly the disappointment of seeing the Ferraris race off into the distance and deny us a fight with Williams brought down the unpredictability and on-track racing score. Also, since Rubens was never in the championship fight and Michael scored highly, the championship implications were basically non-existent, and the race set the scene for the rest of the season. Loads more Ferrari 1-2s. I did give the race a bonus point though, as Rubens winning from Michael in a formation finish really did provide a happy ending to an otherwise subpar race. For the 2nd episode in a row, I'll give the Driver of the Day award to Jenson Button, who was really sticking it to the big guns in that Renault and managed to avoid being lapped by the Ferraris. I'll give the Annoy Trophy for Worst Driver to Giancarlo Fisichella for committing the cardinal sin of F1. Drive safe guys, and I'll see you next time.